Masked ICE agents have become the face of President Donald Trump's nationwide deportation campaign as viral videos of violent arrests captivate audiences on social media.
Step back. Step back. I'm on a public road.
But who are they and what motivates them to do the work? Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. To answer those questions and more, USA Today national correspondents Trevor Hughes and Lauren Viagran spent 3 days with ICE agents in Kansas City, part of the Chicago field office tasked with immigration enforcement in a sprawling 6-state region of the Midwest. I will mention here that some of the agents profiled here were not comfortable using their full names in this reporting. Trevor and Lauren, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Dana.
Lauren, I want to start with your reporting on the family of ICE agents that you spent time with. Who are they and how did their involvement with the agency evolve?
So we spent time with an actual family of ICE agents. Dad joined the force when it was still the Immigration and Naturalization Service, just as it was becoming ICE in the wake of 9/11. His kids, Danielle, the eldest daughter, and twin younger brothers, all were federal workers and eventually followed in their father's footsteps and became ICE agents. The 3 kids last year completed the ICE Academy during a presidential election in which immigration was the central debate. The father, Robert, was coming up on retirement, mandatory retirement at age 57, and he ultimately left the force in May, only to be called back in June by the Trump administration. And when he got that email offering retirees to come back to the force, he jumped at the opportunity. And now he and his kids work together for the agency.
The perspective of the agents themselves have been notably absent from the public conversation about the arrests and deportations. And I'd like to ask you both what the agents you spoke with shared with you here. Trevor, I'll start with you.
You know, these are folks who see themselves as very much law and order Americans. These are people who, in many cases, were former police officers, former military, who deeply love our country and believe that they are serving its best interests by carrying out these immigration enforcements. One of the things that we heard over and over was, the pendulum swings back and forth between presidents. President Biden had a more lax approach to immigration enforcement. President Trump has a much stricter approach to immigration enforcement. And so there is this sense within the agency as a whole, and with the folks that we talk to, that they now have the opportunity to enforce the laws that are on the books, that have been written by Congress. And so they are enforcing what the elected representatives of Americans have voted for.
Now, it's important to remember that immigration enforcement today looks a lot different than it did a year ago, not only because of presidential politics or, the policies of the current or even former administrations. The Trump administration has dramatically expanded the number of law enforcement officers who are working on immigration enforcement. So whereas a year ago, ICE had 6,000 deportation officers, the folks who are, out on the street making targeted arrests in the interior of the country, today the Trump administration has assigned more than 15,000 federal law enforcement officers to the task of immigration enforcement. That also includes Border Patrol, CBP, FBI, DEA, a number of 3-letter agencies. So the style and focus of enforcement is not only in ICE's hands, but in the hands of a broad swath of really rapidly evolving leadership on immigration enforcement.
Trevor, Trump has said agents are prioritizing, quote, the worst of the worst. But statistics show that nearly half of those arrested by ICE and about 3/4 of those in detention have no pending criminal charges or convictions. Did the agents acknowledge this? What did they tell you?
There is a sense among the agents that the ones that we spent time with, and it's important to bear in mind that we saw, a very narrow slice of how things are done. But what we saw was targeted enforcement of people with criminal records, with convictions, with deportation orders. But the agents do acknowledge that there is a sort of a broader enforcement action going on. And I think they are really feeling the pressure from Americans, which is why we got the access we did. They're really frustrated that they're out there arresting people with criminal records, people who have convictions for child abuse or sexual assaults or drunk driving. And they're out there making those arrests. And the American public is instead focusing on some of the other detentions that are in many cases being done by other agencies.
For many Americans, this year is the first time that they are seeing federal agents conduct immigration enforcement in a really massive way on American city streets. In the border zone, communities from Tucson to El Paso to San Diego have, had long experience with federal immigration enforcement. For much of America, this is brand new. And so I think there is certainly a lot of friction there. One of the agents we spoke with expressed it this way, saying that, as the public increasingly distrusts immigration enforcement, it's made it also hard for agents to trust the public. And that is one of the reasons why they are wearing masks, which is a huge debate right now about whether law enforcement officers should be masked.
Trevor, as our listeners probably know, the response to masked federal agents in major American cities has included shootings, attacks on ICE facilities, vehicles being rammed into. You would think that would pose a real obstacle to recruitment. What did agents tell you about their sense of personal safety?
I mean, these are folks who are absolutely concerned about their personal safety every single day. They talk about checking, the buildings to make sure there's no one stalking them. They park their cars in different places. They're, vague when they talk to community members about what it is that they actually do for a living. What we heard, though, is that there are quite a lot of ICE agents who are joining the force. The Trump administration has really put out the call. They're dangling very significant incentives, helping people get rid of student loans, lots and lots of overtime here. And so there are quite a lot of people who are joining up, even though they know there has been a significant increase in assaults and attacks against ICE agents and other immigration officers.
To be sure, there is a aggressive recruitment campaign by DHS, by the Department of Homeland Security, to bring on new immigration enforcement officers. And while legacy officers, some of them may be uncomfortable in the new environment in which there is a sharp spotlight on their work, and in some cases that's putting them in danger. There are new recruits out there who are joining because of this enforcement style and strategy. And I think the one thing that we know for sure is that a year from now, immigration enforcement in this country is going to look dramatically different than it even does today. It's something that is going to be growing and going to be more ubiquitous across the country.
Trevor, you wrote about how ICE agents who've been around since Biden feel about Trump's shift in tactics with regards to immigrants here illegally. Can you elaborate on that for me?
There is a sense among the ICE agents and the ICE officers that I talk to that they now have the opportunity to enforce the laws as written. There has been this sense of the pendulum swinging back and forth. But a lot of these folks who are law and order kinds of people get very frustrated when they see someone breaking a law and they feel like they're not allowed to enforce that law in the way they think it should be done. And President Trump has really said to them, go out and essentially arrest as many people as you can, detain as many people as you can. That, in some ways, runs counter to how longtime ICE officers have worked, which is targeted enforcement, the worst of the worst. But there is this sense that the American public is seeing a new kind of enforcement, and that is really changing the relationship between ICE and the communities that it serves across America. And so I think some of the newer agents signed up for this, right? They're joining the agency at a time when the Trump administration has very strongly recruited them precisely to do this kind of work. And some of the agents and officers who've been there a long time, it's a shift for them.
I mean, look, according to the Migration Policy Institute, roughly 6 million migrants entered the country under what the Biden administration called lawful pathways, either seeking asylum or getting some kind of parole into the country. Those programs, while not challenged in a court of law, were widely viewed by Republicans and many law enforcement officers as being illegitimate. And so there is, I think it can't be underestimated how a swath of the American public, certainly millions of voters, viewed that influx of migrants in the wake of a pandemic during a period of economic strife across the globe. There was a lot of anger. And what we're seeing today in terms of, again, as Trevor has mentioned, the pendulum swinging back, is an effort to remove many of those people, or, in the case of those who hold temporary protected status, seeing their status stripped away.
Lauren, a lot of the conversation on social media has to do with what people see as an escalation and aggression as to how the arrests are being executed, with agents smashing windows, violently pulling people from their cars. You rode along with agents when they were making arrests. Can you describe what you witnessed?
Twice this year, once during the Biden administration, and recently in Kansas City with Trump in office, I've been on a ride along with ICE agents, and I've seen how they prefer to work. Typically, ICE officers, deportation officers, conduct surveillance for days or weeks on a given target who they know has a criminal record. As Trevor mentioned, it's usually a very serious criminal record. And they prefer to make a quiet arrest, swoop in, arrest the person in a vehicle stop, preferably with not too many members of the public around, for the public safety and the safety of the agents. And that's the sort of targeted arrest that we witnessed in Kansas City in November.
One thing that's interesting to note is that the ICE agents that we talk to, they are seeing an escalation in the force that's used against them. And you have to bear in mind that they are police officers, and police officers are trained to use a continuum of force. And so if someone they're trying to detain knows that detention likely means deportation, which is frankly what it means for many, many people these days. Under the Biden administration, you might have been detained, but you would have been paroled back into the community and you could work and live. These days, what we're hearing more and more is that if you are sort of detained under the Trump administration, it's unlikely you're coming back out of detention. The ICE officers that we saw, they understand that they're dealing with folks who have a lot to lose now. And so they are concerned that they are going to deal with fights, they're going to deal with force. And then you also have community members who don't necessarily understand what's happening, who do see these social media videos of these seemingly random, detention sweeps, with officers sort of walking through a community, grabbing people from a car wash, grabbing people from a field, sort of willy-nilly rather than with some sort of warrant or some sort of target list. And so you have this kind of toxic mix of escalation, and that's being met by further escalation on both sides.
It's important to note that immigrant families, immigrant communities are now, after roughly 9 months of this increased enforcement, terrified. So even people who don't have a criminal record, people who may not even be immigrants, but who may be targeted because of their race or where they work, are fearful and are reacting in many cases out of that fear. So the law enforcement officers are operating in a very tense environment.
And, what we've also seen from experts is a concern that the tactics that not just ICE agents are using, but Border Patrol are using, that is fraying the bonds between communities and police agencies who are not conducting immigration enforcement, right? Following the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of talk about reforming police departments, and many, many police departments across the country worked really, really hard to build relationships with immigrant communities on the theory that if you are hurt or attacked or something in America, the justice system is on your side, will work with you. And so now a lot of local police departments have concerns about the tactics that they're seeing because they feel like it really violates the trust that they've been trying to build with those immigrant communities.
I want to ask you both this. The agents have wide discretion over the immigrants on their docket, meaning they can also hold the fate of immigrant families in their hands. What did they tell you about how they wield that power?
We heard a lot from the agents about how careful and respectful they are. I mean, they work with, or are in many cases, former police officers who have spent a lot of time training on due process and constitutional rights. And so, we heard over and over their commitment to following the law, to making sure that people did have their day in court, whether that was criminal court or immigration court. We heard from them about how they treat pregnant people, how they treat single parents. And so, the folks that we spent time with are very aware of how much power they have when it comes to sort of pulling families apart. And they really understand the impact that it has on those families. But at the same time, they also understand their obligations as, enforcement officers under this White House.
And again, I think it's impossible to tell the story about this particular office in Kansas City without acknowledging that it's a microcosm existing in a larger context in which, again, there are thousands of other law enforcement officers and border agents on immigration enforcement. And there are specific operations that are sweeping through cities meant to surge enforcement in a way that may be less targeted, as we've seen in Los Angeles, Chicago, Charlotte, New Orleans, and now Minneapolis. So again, it's an evolving situation in which both, the American public and law enforcement officers, immigration agents and officers are really creating and living through a new reality.
Lauren Vigron and Trevor Hughes are USA Today national correspondents. Thank you so much for sharing your reporting here on The Excerpt.
Of course.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.